participants and listeners from around the world. I'm Kristen Schwartz, licensed midwife and MC for Gold Learning. And I'm here today. I have a special guest with me, and with me here today is the amazing Dr. Kathleen Kendall-Tackett. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Kristen.
It is so wonderful to have you here at Gold with me. I know you have spoken for us here before, and I have to tell our listeners we are in for an amazing treat. Dr. Kendall-Tackett will be giving our opening keynote for this year's Lactation Online conference here at Gold of 2019. But before we get to that, Kathleen, can you tell our listeners a little bit where are you located in the world? We have such an amazing international audience, so they are probably wondering where are you coming to them today?
Well, I live in Amarillo, Texas, which is up in the panhandle of Texas. So if you think about the state of Texas, you see the little part that pops up on the top. That's where I live.
Okay.
That's actually not North Texas, believe it or not. That's
Hmm.
West Texas. But we're in the high plains, and we're kind of out in the middle of nowhere. For 100 miles in any direction, we have wide open prairie. So we are actually, right along the line. We're right next to the state of New Mexico and northern New
Mhm.
Mexico. So we're at about 3,700 feet. So we're high desert, and
Height.
so yeah, we're
Oh,
we're in a very different part of Texas than most people what most people think of as Texas.
that's interesting. That is interesting. And we have just started spring here at the beginning of spring. What is spring like where you are?
Well, we're finally also getting some spring. It's been actually really a pretty cold winter here too, because again, like I said, because we're up on the high plains,
Mm,
we've had several snowstorms this year, and
wow.
we haven't been hit quite as bad as some other parts in the country, but it's definitely
Right.
been chilly.
Yeah. Yeah, snowstorm is not something we usually envision when we think of Texas, right?
No, no, as I said, our area is actually really quite different than the rest of the state.
Oh. Well, thank you for sharing that. And now to you, Kathleen. Some of our listeners already know you. You're quite well known in the lactation field. But to our listeners, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional background and your journey?
Sure. Yeah, I started off as a family violence researcher. I have my degree in developmental psychology, and, you know, several years ago, I actually switched to the field of health psychology because it was kind of a better match for kind of the things I was interested in. And a lot of the work I do is in the area of like family violence and trauma,
Mm,
and I'm especially interested in how like things like childhood trauma impact health. And I became interested about 25 years ago in postpartum depression,
mm,
and so postpartum depression and family violence, there's a lot of sort of overlap. And the breastfeeding part of it actually didn't start off as a profession. It started off as something that was fun. I
mhm,
started off being a volunteer sort of peer supporter with La Leche League.
mhm.
And then, people started asking me in La Leche League if I would lecture on the areas that I do research in, which is,
Right.
perinatal depression and trauma and family violence. And, so those fields, those things started sort of merging. And that's kind of how I kind of came to this sort of hybrid of what the type of work I do now. So I really actually consider my work mostly in women's health. That's really the sort of umbrella term that I use that covers kind of every area that I'm interested in. Because I'm interested in trauma, I'm interested
Yeah.
in depression, I'm interested in PTSD and,
Mhm.
and and breastfeeding and how all those things sort of intersect. I'm also very interested in maternal infant sleep because that's a just a key
Mm,
variable when you look at all of those other topics. And
right.
so, I find that intersects with that quite a bit too. And we're going to actually talk about that in this talk.
Wonderful. Yeah, it sounds like this all fits very well together. The different disciplines, your background as well as talking about breastfeeding, infant sleep and such. It feels like such a wonderful combination. You mentioned just now that you've done research on perinatal depression starting 25 years ago. That must have been a new field. It feels like just to me recently we start acknowledging and talking about it more in the last few years. But 25 years ago, were you one of those trailblazers, I must say, because I don't think there was much information out there at that time, right?
Well, when I first started, it's like one of the things that really struck me was that, this what everybody was talking about with perinatal depression
Mm,
was, it's all caused by the drop in estrogen and
mm,
progesterone, and it was very sort of anti breastfeeding at that point, and it's like, mothers were always told that to wean their babies if they'd been diagnosed with depression. And we started getting some movement when we started discovering that there were some medications that mothers could take while continuing breastfeeding, but still it was it's kind of like, oh well, if you must, I guess we'll support you,
Hmm.
kind of thing. And I really feel like that field has come a long way in
Right.
terms of acknowledging the needs of breastfeeding mothers, and I'm excited about that
Hmm.
because it was a long time coming. Because I used to go to those conferences sometimes, and I'd be at a 2-day conference and they wouldn't mention the word breastfeeding even once.
Oh,
You know, which is kind of amazing when you're
yeah.
talking about the experience of new mothers. I mean, how can you actually not talk about that?
Right.
And we still have some kind of misunderstandings. Like a lot of times, in the perinatal depression field, they'll tell mothers not to breastfeed at night. Which anybody in lactation knows that that's not exactly practical
No,
advice.
no.
No,
And why
and the
is
moms.
that? Why is that? Why are they told to be not to breastfeed at night?
Well, they have this idea that if the mother gets uninterrupted sleep,
Oh.
that it's going to decrease her risk for depression, and to some extent that's true. But what they're recommending oftentimes is a period of like 8 hours,
Mm.
and I think that that's the thing that's kind of the critical. And they also don't think about things like where is that baby sleeping, because
Yeah.
of course that makes a difference. We find actually that the mothers that get the most sleep are the ones who are exclusively breastfeeding and bed sharing.
Right.
And so that does, the sleep location and the feeding method actually all contribute to that sort of sleep. And the mothers who, are reporting the most sleep are the ones that everybody would expect would be getting the least amount of
Hmm.
sleep. But the mothers experience themselves and all the other variables that go with it, all the measures of well-being and, their physical health and,
Right.
the things that kind of give us an idea are very consistent on this point. And we've seen this in about 3 different studies now, that exclusively breastfeeding mothers do get more sleep. But there's a misunderstanding of that because you think, oh, yeah, well, if you're breastfeeding, you're waking up more.
Hmm.
But they're not realizing that the mothers are going back to sleep more
More
quickly.
quickly.
And so their total amount of sleep is actually better. And so this idea that, you're just going to sort of take the baby away and it's going to fix it,
No.
it really doesn't.
Yeah.
So that's been kind of one of the latest things, that there's been a lot of misunderstanding about. And so I think it's really important that we kind of come at those kind of questions with data.
With data. Yes. I totally agree. I mean, when we have the data, that's quite powerful because, then it's not
Yeah.
just like, oh, hearsay or case studies. It is based on,
Right.
on facts. Yeah. I
Right.
agree.
Well, and and again, like I said, one of the things that we found that I was really struck by was that there was a real difference, a huge difference between exclusive and partial breastfeeding
Hmm.
in terms of the protective effects on maternal mental health.
Right.
It's like I thought originally when I looked at the data, when you look at the graph, that it was a dose response effect, that the more the mother breastfed, the bigger the protection.
Huh.
But what we really found when we actually, did the post hoc statistics, and I think that's kind of where so the action was, and we found this really consistently across all the variables, that exclusive breastfeeding is a completely different animal than partial feeding or exclusive formula feeding. And in fact, there was no significant difference between the exclusively formula feeding mothers and the partially breastfeeding mothers. And that actually, I have to admit, really surprised me.
That is
But
surprising.
exclusive breastfeeding is, yeah,
Huh.
I was really actually stunned by that. But we found that consistently across every single variable we looked at.
Mm.
So it kind of tells us that it was a real effect. And now we've got a few more recent studies that have actually found the same thing. So
Interesting.
I think there really is a physiological difference from the mother's perspective if they're exclusively breastfeeding. And I think the thing that's really hard is that oftentimes what people are trying to help, and the first piece of advice they give to a mother is, oh, just go ahead and supplement.
Right.
And it's like all the data really indicates that if you start doing that, you're going to be going backwards, not forward.
Interesting.
That the mothers are going to be more tired and they're going to get less rest. But a lot of times mothers get really pressured
Yeah.
into that. Because everybody thinks that I think really honestly people are really genuinely trying to help, but
Mm-hmm.
again, like I said, I think this is where we've got to be guided by data.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I agree. I agree. When we have the data, and we can really show the difference, that will be
Hmm.
increasingly helpful. Now, about your presentation. So the title is "Does Breastfeeding Protect Maternal Mental Health and the Role of Oxytocin in Stress?" So tell us a little bit what you will be presenting on in this keynote presentation.
Okay, so for the last few years, I've been doing a presentation called "A New Paradigm for Depression in New Mothers," where I've looked at the impact of stress, and particularly that sort of inflammatory response system as it relates to depression. So it's the activation of the 3-part stress system that sort of is the thing that underlies depression. And what I'm doing in this talk is actually kind of stepping back and taking even a bigger, you know, picture approach to depression and breastfeeding, and looking at that sort of relationship between the stress response and the oxytocin response. And the two responses are actually controlled by a part in the brain called the paraventricular nucleus. And so it's like one of the things that we know is that when one response is turned on, the other is turned off. They sort of mutually cancel each other out. So I actually have characterized it like a light switch, that when one side's up, the other side is down. And so if you look at, depression and breastfeeding in that context and realize, that if a mom, particularly exclusively breastfeeding, she's activating that oxytocin system, then she's downregulating that stress response that we know that underlies depression. And so that's the kind of lens I'm looking at this. And this is actually kind of came from some of my work with Dr. Kirsten Uvnes-Moberg, who is the oxytocin researcher. One of the things we kind of started, collaborating on, about 3 years ago, is we kind of realized we were basically talking about the same thing. We were talking about two sides of the same coin. She's talking about the oxytocin response. I'm talking about the stress response. And we're realizing that basically what we're looking at is kind of the same thing. So what happens when one side is up and the other is down? And I think if you understand this, because, one of the things that people get confused with this whole issue of depression and breastfeeding is, we know that a depressed mother is less likely to breastfeed. She's less likely to initiate, and she's less likely to breastfeed for a longer period of time. She tends to wean more quickly. So I've always kind of said that depression is a direct threat to breastfeeding. If mother is depressed, it is a threat. And that's one of the reasons why I've spent years training lactation consultants and WIC peer counselors and peer supporters and legislative league leaders and, spot depression, kind of have some idea, not treat it, but, have some idea of like, that it exists and help the mom, sort of get some help and support, because it is really critical.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes people get kind of confused because they think, I think the data are pretty clear that exclusive breastfeeding does protect a mother's mental health. But what about this other thing where you've got, depression being a threat to breastfeeding? And it's like that sort of, apparent contradiction is easier to understand if you look at it in this framework of oxytocin versus stress. Because again, like I said, if we can get that oxytocin side up, it is going to be protective.
Right.
But what happens if a mom's having problems? Which side is going to be up? Obviously the stress side is going to be up.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that case, it's not going to be protective. If she's having problems,
Right.
it's actually going to trigger depression. And I think sometimes people get that mixed up, because they say, oh, yeah, well, yeah, look at this. And this study showed no difference. And the first thing you got to look at is, okay, what do they mean by breastfeeding? Okay, are they just lumping everybody together? Because we do know there's a difference, exclusive versus partial. It does make a difference. The other question you have to ask is, are these mothers having problems? Because that's not going to be protective. In fact, that's going to have the opposite effect. So we got to be thinking, pretty much through all of these questions with which side of that system is activated. And that's actually what I'm going to talk about in this presentation.
Absolutely fascinating. I can't wait for your presentation. I want to know more about it now.
Well, thank you.
That is absolutely fantastic. Well, thank you so much. So, what are you hoping before I let you go that the delegates will take away from it in the end after listening to you?
I'm hoping that they will see what a naturally protective thing breastfeeding is for mothers. I think sometimes, and I especially see this in the perinatal depression world, people have this idea that only the baby is benefiting. And it's just simply not true. That the mother benefits too. That, the mother and baby are sort of a, dependent system. And so what's good for the baby also is good for the mother. And it's like we don't want to ever have it in the situation where the mother is like sacrificing her mental health, just in the sake of feeding. It's like it
Right.
just kills me when I hear these stories about mothers, soldiering through with nipple pain for weeks. It's like, gosh, that's just awful. And you're really risking her mental health.
Mm-hmm.
But I want people to actually come away with understanding what a marvelous system this is. And I'll show some data that I tend to show in a lot of my presentations just because I think it's so powerful. Is like we looked at the impact of sexual assault. We in our sample we had 994 women who identified as having been raped. Okay, so the most serious kind,
Right.
of sexual abuse. In I said that tends to be sort of a big threshold in terms of when you look at effects. Okay, so the most serious kind, and what we found is if a mother was exclusively breastfeeding, She still had trauma symptoms, but what it seemed to do from a physiological standpoint is dial them down.
Hmm.
Okay. And so even when mothers experience a very serious trauma, we find that breastfeeding is protective. Now, those moms are still definitely at risk for depression,
Right.
but they're at lowered risk compared to women who have a sexual assault history who are either partially feeding or are exclusively formula feeding. And it was really, really striking the differences. And the one I thought was particularly striking was the impact on anger and irritability.
Hmm.
There was a gigantic difference on that. And I think that that really just does make a lot of sense. And especially when you compare our data to what Lane Strathern found in his study when he looked at 7,500 mother-infant pairs, and he was looking at the impact of breastfeeding on maternal perpetrated child maltreatment. And they had 500 documented cases of either physical abuse or neglect. Okay, and what they found is that if mothers breastfed their babies for 4 months or longer, they were 3.8 times less likely to neglect them and 2.6 less
Hmm.
times less likely to physically abuse them.
Wow.
And it's like when you see that, how the exclusively breastfeeding mothers were basically pretty chill.
Hmm.
They really actually didn't look different than the non-sexually assaulted moms. But the ones who didn't have breastfeeding as that physiological mechanism to turn off the stress response tended to actually have a big spike in anger and irritability.
Wow.
And so again, I just think that, what a wonderful adaptive system this is.
Yeah.
That you don't have to even have a perfect, sort of childhood or upbringing, that breastfeeding is basically a do-over.
Huh.
And I just think that's incredibly powerful.
That is powerful. That's incredible. You know, Oh my goodness, Dr. Kathleen Kendall-Tackett, just by talking to you, I learned so much, and I haven't even watched the presentation yet. This is wonderful. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And thank you for being here with us today and chatting with me about this presentation.
Well, I'm really excited about it, and I hope everybody who tunes in finds it helpful.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This presentation, Does Breastfeeding Protect Maternal Mental Health? The Role of Oxytocin in Stress, is the opening keynote to the Gold Lactation online conference. And to our listeners, this presentation is open access, which means it's free of charge. So we highly encourage you to join us for this presentation, join us for the conference, and tell your colleagues and friends and anybody interested in the topic about it. It's going to be an amazing presentation, and it's free and open access. So make sure to check it out at goldlearning.com. This presentation will be presented twice on April 1st, so make sure you take advantage of that. And to find out more about this presentation and the other presentations in the Gold Lactation Online Conference, please visit goldlactation.com. And also, Dr. Kathleen Kendall-Tackett has been so kind to donate some of her wonderful books. So if you would like to be able to win a copy of them, please join us for this presentation. Thank you all for participating with us today. And thank you to all our listeners. And thank you again, Dr. Kathleen Kendall-Tackett. Bye bye for now.